Welcome, and thank you for joining our Reliability of Regulatory Returns webinar in partnership with Marcus Evans. Before we begin, we'd like to introduce ourselves. Monocle is an independent management consultancy with nearly 20 years of international experience. We specialize in providing bespoke solutions to banks and insurers. Our specialist business domain knowledge and technical skills allow us to bridge the divide between stakeholders' needs and the complex systems, processes, and data that our clients rely on. We categorize our services into 7 key capabilities. They are finance, risk and regulation, business change and cost transformation, market conduct and compliance, data and technology, digital enterprise transformation, financial markets operations, and customer centricity. These capabilities allow us to provide our clients with the best in-class solutions across a broad range of finance, risk, treasury, and compliance requirements. With offices in South Africa, the UK, and the Netherlands, we are well positioned to support our clients internationally as a preferred execution partner. We are passionate about the change that we are able to deliver for our clients who operate at the heart of our economies. Monocle, we design change.
Hello, good morning or good afternoon, depending where you're based. My name is Claudia and I'm with the Marcus Evans Group. Thank you so much for joining today's webinar on reliability of regulatory returns, brought to you in partnership with Monocle. Before I begin, I would like to cover a few housekeeping items. As you can see in the bottom of your screen are multiple application widgets you can use. All those widgets are resizable, movable, so feel free to move them around to get the most out of your desktop space. If you have any questions during today's webinar, go ahead and submit it through the Q&A widget. We will try to answer as many questions as possible, but if a full answer is needed or we just run out of time, do not worry at all. Someone from the Monocle team will get back in touch after today's event via email or perhaps contact you via phone. Copies of today's slide deck and some additional materials are available to you on the resource list. Please do go ahead and just download those resources, make sure that you're all on top of those and that you are going ahead and download them all. Survey, we have 3 very simple questions. We want to know, what do you want to hear next? So please go ahead and answer those 3 questions. It will not take you more than a minute to do so. We depend on these surveys to be answers. So please go ahead and answer all the survey questions. With that said, I do not want to delay anymore this exciting time. We have an amazing panel lineup today, so I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Theo, who is going to be moderating today's sessions. All right, I'll catch you up later. Thank you.
Thank you, Claudia. Hi, everyone. A warm welcome from sunny South Africa. I'm Theo Kum, your host and the Business Development and Research Director at Monocle. Today, we are discussing how to ensure the reliability of regulatory returns through the successful integration of data across the institution. So dialing in today are representatives from 111 organizations and about 39 countries around the world. Thank you all for taking the time to join, and please be sure to send us your questions during the course of the webinar, so no need to wait until the end. Let's make it more interactive and interesting. Joining me to unpack this topic is a panel of SMEs. Firstly is Colin Ware, Regulatory Product Manager in Asset Servicing at BNY Mellon UK. Colin ensures that his clients' needs are met in terms of their regulatory disclosures and has worked on the implementation of various regulations at BNY and previously as regulatory SME at other Tier 1 UK banks. Also joining us, Rishabh Rai, Regulatory Reporting Analyst and Assistant Treasurer at Union Bank of India, based in the UK. With close to a decade of international experience in the regulatory space, he holds a master's degree in the mechanics of regulatory reporting. Very relevant and interesting background indeed. Also joining is Francis Gross, Senior Advisor at the European Central Bank. He has a lead role in the Global Legal Entity Identifier Initiative and has a keen interest in the sustainable digitization of the economy with a focus on efficient and effective measurement. Francis brings a very rich perspective and has a very rich career, but today his comments, as our other panelists, are in his own capacity. Somebody speaking in a personal and also professional capacity is Rita Dupria, Monaco Consulting Director for the UK and Europe. Rita is a seasoned consultant who has led several strategic regulatory change projects in the finance, risk, treasury and compliance space, including global engagements where we have addressed exactly the topic we are addressing today. Hello everyone, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us. As further reference, our full bios are part of the panel and you guys can check us out during the conversation if you wish. But before we unpack the specifics of this topic, I just thought let's take a moment just to kind of consider for a second why we have decided today and deem it necessary to kind of discuss this topic. Why at this point in time? So basically in September 2021, the PRA released its thematic findings related to its 2019 Dear CEO letter, which it kind of labeled the reliability of regulatory returns. It was very clear that the PRA was set on addressing this. It was clearly an issue that they wanted to investigate, and they released their findings quite recently around this. And it highlighted real concerns regarding governance and ownership, controls, and data and investment. So the way we see it, reliability or reliability of reporting is not only a regulatory requirement. These reports represent, at a minimum, the insights you require to run an institution and should therefore be available and reliable. But it seems that's not the case, hence the concern by the PRA. But this is not a new topic. The BIS, the Bank of International Settlement, released the BCBS 239, the very famous paper on radar or risk data aggregation and risk reporting, as it's known, in 2013 already. This is following the global financial crisis, where it said banks' information technology and data architecture were inadequate to support the broad management of financial risk and basically also reporting. Yet here we are in 2021, and the PRA has indicated it is disappointed and has now threatened that it will consider the full range of supervisory responses and enforcement powers at its disposal. And through our engagements in the market, we see this as remaining a problem, not only in the UK or under the PRA, but also elsewhere. And therefore, given the importance of reg reporting to the overall regulatory process, it's worth addressing and unpacking this topic as it has broad application. Failure in this space can be of material consequence to the individual banks by way of fines or reputational risk, but also the financial system at large. This is basically the map by which the regulators chart the path and manage the responses effectively. And if the data is missing, is unreliable, we clearly have a problem in the system. And we ask the question, why is that problem still now? And how can it be addressed? And Monaco's position is, we believe that looking at the fundamentals within the data and process design will allow institutions to create alignment and efficiency across the data landscape, leading to reliable or more reliable reporting, regulatory and otherwise. But enough of that. Let's see if our panel agrees. Good. So let me kick us off with the first question. So clearly, guys, I've now stated that these issues have been with us, it's been on our radar for quite some time. Why is this still an issue? I think that's the fundamental question. I think, Francis, I'll pass this one on to you and hear your response.
Thank you very much, Theo. Yeah, well, I think that the question is perhaps not the right one. Why is this still that way? Actually, the problem keeps growing. Where does it come from? It simply comes from technology, the use of technology in financial institutions and in the authorities as well. If you look at it from today's perspective, so everyone looking at his own little silo, his own business, I believe there is no solution in sight, because even if you clean up your data in your own house, you are exchanging data with thousands of counterparties day in, day out through automated systems. Those systems, well, each one designs them the way they see fit. So the systems don't talk to each other very well. We tried to progress on standardization, but that progress is way too slow. So I believe that the institutions that are addressed by the PRA's Dear CEO letter actually have no chance of doing better. The only way to improve things would be to work together, to go to the root cause. What are these root causes? It's the fact that we apply technology the way we see fit for our own interest, each business for themselves. And those choices are very different, not coherent. And at the same time, our ability to measure what's going on is decreasing. So risk is actually a derived notion. To understand whether there is risk in the system, you first need to be able to measure the system. And reliability is also an evolving notion. Data about, say that you receive about things 6 weeks ago, and you need another 6 weeks to compile, quality assure, and then analyze, is reliable if it refers to events that took place 3 months ago and whose impact is very slow. But it is not reliable at all if you look at events that unfold in real time, which the system can give us today. So we have a more fundamental question to address, and it's a collective one.
Okay, and I take it that you've kind of seen some of these kind of challenges and potential solutions through your global legal entity identifier initiatives that you're running.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I came to statistics back in 2006 after a number of years at the ECB and organization, but then before that in the automotive industry on the globalization side. And I was shocked to see the state of data in finance. And I realized immediately that this is not sustainable. The way we collect data, we'll come to that later. And I realized the problem is a global ocean growing by the day. And I wondered what can be done. So I was lucky to be at the ECB because there you can make things move. And the starting point was simply to say, well, okay, if you want to measure the system, we need to collect data from reality. Reality happens at the level of contracts, legal entities, or the micro elements that make up the system. I see the economy as a network of contracts that connects a global population of parties. So I thought, well, a first step, feasible, might be to put a number plate on each one of these vehicles out there. And that needs to be the same globally. That gave me a fright at first because there is no global regulator. It took me 2 hours to figure, 2 years, 2 hours would be nice, 2 years to figure out the concept that could work. And well, luckily in a way, 2008 came in and showed how unsustainable the measurement system is in total for everyone. Private businesses didn't know their exposures. Regulators didn't know which domino would cut down next. Lucky, Jean-Claude Trichet, president of the ECB, is an engineer, and he got the idea at once. And that gave the support. But I mean, what's a little bit sad in the story is that this happened now nearly 13 years ago. And the coverage is progressing, but it's far from what it should be, actually. And today we have all blue cars with 3 doors on the road that have a number plate, but all the others don't yet. So
Excellent.
It's a bit like with climate change. We need to change tack.
Okay. So Francis, I think you've kind of touched on the important point of the role of the regulator. And I want to park the question for later to see what the regulator can be doing differently. Rita, from your perspective, being a practitioner on these projects and having dealt with it, what do you view as being the issues or the root cause of this? Because I think it, to a certain extent, almost speaks to the solution ultimately, if one understands that accurately.
Yeah, thank you, Theo, and good day, everybody. I do agree with Francis. I think technology, even though it is an enabler for us to help solve a lot of these problems, has not been our friend if you look at the sheer volumes of data that gets produced. And with all the data that does get produced, there's more management that is required to put on top of this data. Now, I do think we also need to take a little bit of a step back and just look at how we got into this point, right? When you look at regulatory reports, there are so many different teams involved in getting a regulatory report done. There's a finance team, there's a risk team, whether it be credit risk, market risk, operational risk. And each of these teams have created processes in isolation. Everybody needs to build a process that suits their own requirements. And they go and extract their source data, they transform the source data, they apply the business logic that they need to do to get to a result. But the manner in which these things are extracted, the processes that get built, do not get built for the enterprise and to satisfy the enterprise's requirements. It gets built to satisfy a specific team's requirements. And these processes, often when they get maintained, one person would maintain it in a certain way, another guy would forget to apply a filter or forget to change a business rule. And in the end, you end up with such a disparate process and data that doesn't get treated in the same way that it is impossible to actually reconcile those returns at the end and to show that the data that you're reporting from a financial perspective and the data that you're reporting from a risk perspective actually comes from the same source and has the same meaning. I think one of the other challenges that we often face in this space is the need for manual adjustments. We all know that in a workday schedule, people are under pressure and they have to do things really quickly. But when we start applying manual adjustments, and especially if we don't apply them consistently across the various disciplines, that's when we start facing challenges. And that's when our data becomes even further out of sync. Theo, I think we've created a slide just to show sort of a conceptual landscape of reporting, which is very simplistic. And we do understand it's very simplistic, but maybe we can use that to just quickly talk through a few of these root causes, just to illustrate where they're coming from. So I think on the left-hand side there, we all recognize that's the one, thanks Theo. We all recognize that there are multiple source systems, and the data from these source systems get extracted for multiple different processes. Now, what we see in the banks frequently is that we have different technologies and different processes to extract this data. We apply different business rules every time we extract the data. Now, ironically, even though when we talk about regulatory reports, we're talking about different views and different slices and dices of essentially the same data aggregated to different levels, but applying slightly different business rules. So the fact that we are using so many different processes and duplicating so many processes to extract this data not only creates an issue from a reliability perspective, like I said, when people don't change or maintain business rules in the same way, it actually also creates an issue on resource constraint, because the organization has to maintain these processes. They have to have skilled resources and various technologies to make sure that these processes can actually remain up and running. If you move on from there, we generally have different technologies to provide us with risk outputs for the different disciplines. And I think that's okay, right? We have different vendors are specialized in different things, and we want to use the best of breed. But when we look at these systems, that's where the adjustments come in. So in credit risk, as an example, I realize a counterparty has got an incorrect classification. I jump in and I make my adjustment, but I don't actually tell the guy in interest rate risk or liquidity risk to make that same adjustment. They might realize the counterparty is classified incorrectly and make a completely different adjustment, which just sort of amplifies this issue of not getting data at the end that reconciles. If you move on from there, our outputs are generally also not centralized and not integrated, right? Which means I, out of my credit risk process, generate the metrics that I need and I pass it on, and the reporting process puts it into a report. But because it's not integrated, we spend so many hours, and in some cases even days, just reconciling and explaining differences in outputs, trying to show why the number in my balance sheet is not 100% the same as the number in my credit risk exposure. And that takes away the real benefit that those resources could provide. If you look to the right-hand side, if we could minimize those reconciliation processes, if we could automate a control framework on top of this to make sure that we trust the business rules that we're applying, we trust the data that we're sourcing, we can free up hours or even days of resource time to spend on actually doing proper data analysis, getting strategic insights into our data, providing our management with proper management information, customer valuation metrics to say, where should I as a business be focusing? Where am I going to actually get my strategic benefit? At the end of the day, we've got so many resources who spend time and effort just preparing data, reconciling data, adjusting data, that the benefits of having a controlled environment around our regulatory reporting is not just a tick in the box for the regulator, right? And if it's seen as that, then we're probably setting ourselves up for failure. We should see this as the ability to give ourselves comfort that we know and understand the risk that the bank faces, and that we actually can use that data and the environment that we've set up to get strategic insights and to give your business that strategic advantage that it needs in a very competitive market these days.
Thank you, Rita. So what I'm hearing from you is very much that the same thing I heard from Francis is around integration, collaboration. One can't do this on your own. The word silo was used previously as well. So as I go to the next question, I'm going to quickly pop our first poll question. Let me just have a look here, make sure I've got the mechanics correct. There we go. First poll question, if you guys want to. So that's a nice benefit of having a group or a collective of people, of like-minded people with similar backgrounds. You can actually do a bit of a statistical sample and get some insights into what we're all struggling with or where the pain points lie. But on that note, I'd like to move to the next question. Is basically, Rishabh, I'll come to you for this one. Are the issues different for larger or smaller banks? Now, you've had the privilege of working in all these different environments. Obviously, bigger banks, large legacy systems, smaller banks, potentially more integrated, but also maybe more of a tactical setup. What is your view around these kind of issues and what you've seen?
Yeah, thank you, Theo, and good day, everyone. So when we talk about the issues in regulatory reporting, so there are basically operational issues as well as the more fundamental issues. So some of the operational issues that Rita has shed light upon, she has pretty much covered everything. But based on my experience, I have worked in a large as well as small bank. So based on my experience, there is with the large bank, some of the operational issues may be different than what the small banks are facing. For example, the legacy system that you just mentioned. So if I can give you an example, the legacy contracts do not have all the data points that are required to meet the regulators' expectations. So just to simplify it by giving an example, when I was working in India, and so I was working for a big bank, and I'm telling it in a slightly different context. So in the context of KYC AML, so when back in 80s and 90s, when people used to come to a bank for opening an account, all they would require was an attestation from the head of council, which would serve the purpose for their KYC, and they will get their accounts open. And now in 2021, everyone has a unique identity number, and through that number, you can get all the certified details of a person. So in 2021, if a regulators ask for data that is around that unique identification numbers, the banks won't be able to give it because they have thousands and millions of accounts that don't have these data points. Extending this example to the LIBOR transition. So basically, if we can oversimplify the process, what is happening is in a contract, LIBOR is a data point, and the regulators want to remove this data point and add a different data point in terms of a different risk-free rate. And we all know that what are the sorts of difficulties that we are going through. So having a golden source data which is an expectation of the, as mentioned in the BCBS 239 as well, that is a difficult task to achieve, because, and as shed light upon by Rita itself, the other operational aspects is like, to collect that golden source of data, we don't have a single source where all the data is coming from. For example, in a smaller bank, there would be one core banking solution where you need to download some reports. Then there is a different version of CBS for the treasury. So there is a different tool for calculating your LGD, different tool for ECL, and then there are some manual reports that are prepared on Excel. And then you need to collate all these data and which won't talk to each other. They won't be consistent. There would be gaps which you need to manually enrich. And then you have to fed it into a software that will prepare reports for you. And then you will reconcile it with some master data you have prepared, and you would realize that, there is an introduction of new GL code this month, and our software doesn't have the exact mapping for it. And then you don't have enough time to rectify this problem, and then you do some kind of manual adjustments and tactical fixes. So actually, the problem is a more fundamental one. These are just the operational challenges that are there in the large as well as smaller banks. But yeah, operational challenges may differ in a bit, but the fundamental challenge remains the same.
All right. Thank you so much, Rishabh. I'm just smiling because I'm currently involved in a project where we're dealing with 154 new GL codes this month. So it's certainly a real problem. Colin, briefly from your perspective, you have a different take on the problem, I imagine, because you are involved with servicing the regulatory requirements of your clients. How does that differ, or what specifically have you seen as far as that's concerned? Colin? It does seem like Colin is frozen. I don't know, Claudia, Rita, you seeing the same?
Yeah. Yes, I'm also seeing a frozen Colin this morning. It is a bit chilly in the UK.
I just thought it was looking very serious. What I'll do is I'll quickly just publish the results from the poll. Then I'll move on to the next question, which is basically, Rita, it's one for you just briefly, is the PRA talks about the accuracy of reg reporting and the reliability of regulatory returns. I think a lot of people in my mind have comfort and says most of this doesn't apply to me, although I think the poll results potentially show something different. But is it the same thing, accuracy and reliability? Can you just briefly give me your thoughts on that?
I think it's very close, Theo, but I don't think it actually speaks to the same thing. Accuracy, in my mind, speaks to more than just making sure that you trust your processes, right? Accuracy also speaks to your interpretation of the regulatory requirements, the rules that you're applying. Are you applying them correctly? The policy teams tend to get involved and to make sure that what you're interpreting the regulator to request of you is actually what you are doing. The reliability for me pertains more to, do I trust my process? Am I spending hours and hours just to make sure that what I think I'm doing? Or once I've got the policy team who commits to saying, this is how I interpret this rule, this is how I'm going to apply to the data, can I then say that I fully trust the process that I've built to apply it in that way? And what we're really chatting about today is not the interpretation of the regulations or that sort of thing. We are really talking about, how do I build a process that has proper controls around it, that is reliable, and at the end of the day, that we can trust the outputs that we get from that process.
All right. So am I accurate? How do I know that I'm accurate? And how do I convince somebody else I'm accurate, right? What are all those kind of things that support that? All right.
Exactly. And it's not just a trust in the data and trust in the process, but it's also building those checkpoints, right? Building those control framework checkpoints to say, I've reconciled here, and I'm sure that what I started with is still the same thing that I have at the end of the day.
Right. How do I attest to it? Okay, Colin, I see Colin's back. Welcome, Colin.
Apologies.
Francis, a question. No problem. We thought you were looking very serious there and very focused. Francis, a quick question for you, perhaps. How do you see BCBS 239 featuring in the response to this delivery of reliability of reg reporting? What is your take on BCBS 239? Because it basically did set out to give principles to banks to apply, but yet we're still having the problem many years later.
Yeah, I think BCB is a typical example of how regulators work today. They don't want to disturb the industry too much, so they just say what they want to have, and you get organized by yourselves. But doing that, they give them mission impossible. Just going back to what Rishab said, he talked about all these diverse silos where people have a different representation of their identity. That's where the problem lies. The system is made up of a network of facts. So it's a network of contracts that connect a global population of entities. Each contract is a fact, each entity is a fact. Let's just stay there. For the whole data world to work, what we would need ideally is that for one fact, there is a single representation. So the name of a client is written the same in every database. And just to make it simple, has one single identifier used by everyone in operations, in reporting, and so on. And say if you have several representations, even within a bank, you have all the problems in the world to then reconcile that stuff. And you imagine the regulator who needs to look at the entire network of contracts to understand what's going on. He has a hell of an impossible job. So I think BCBS 239, like other principles that have been issued, are right, but it's not sufficient. Necessary, but not sufficient. Another necessary condition is to make sure that we have one representation per fact and that we all use it for all purposes.
Okay. Once again, is that collaboration at the macro level. Rita, your view around BCBS 239? I know you've been very close to the subject and done several projects on it.
Thanks, Theo. Yes, I agree with Francis. I think BCBS 239 does put the principles out there, right? But it doesn't solve the problem. It's not a golden bullet. So I do think that through implementing the principles in BCBS 239, you will get more reliable returns. You will have a better understanding of your process, where your data comes from, how accurate, how timely, how efficient your data is. But just merely putting the principles down does not solve the problem. And I think that also speaks to some of the practical challenges we face. If we do a data lineage mapping and we can show how data traces through the system, it doesn't fix it if it's broken, right? So it does help you to expose the problem. It does help you to understand the problem a little bit better, and to, if you are right, it helps you to get that sense of comfort around the process and the data that you're using. But it's also around how you implement BCBS 239. If you're implementing BCBS 239 merely to tick a regulatory box, I think you're missing a golden opportunity, because you can implement BCBS 239 to give your organization a sense of comfort, and then you can spend time on the real things and the value add. So it is good. It is something that I think it is a good principle and good principles for every bank to implement, but it doesn't solve the problem. And the problem has to be solved in actually going into those data elements, making sure you have single versions of the truth and processes that speak to each other.
Okay. But it would be a good point for the smaller banks to look at. I know specifically in the UK, and maybe that's part of the root cause of why the PRA is still looking at these things, is that it wasn't necessarily, if I recall, applicable to the smaller banks. And it was more on the
Exactly.
Sorry,
and I think you spoke to Rashad a little bit earlier about if size matters. We all know size does matter. But in this case, the bigger banks have had a much bigger emphasis on BCBS 239. They've had to do something about it, right? Because they're classified as GSIPs and DSIPs. Whereas your smaller banks could have kind of swept it under the carpet for a little bit, not for too long, because the PRA does have a focus on this. And I think regulators internationally knows that your reports are only as good as the data that goes into them. So are you really sure that you're giving an accurate reflection of your bank's risk and the data in your bank? And there will be a bigger and bigger emphasis on making sure that your reports are reliable as we continue.
Cool. I'm pushing the next poll question just briefly. I'll leave it up for a few seconds. What are your biggest challenges regarding the reliability of regulatory reporting? This is an interesting one. Good. The next question I have is, the Bank of England highlighted the prevalence of tactical over strategic fixes. It's always the case. Specifically, the use of spreadsheets and our beloved Excel and the control issues around this. Everybody's got experience of this. How do organizations move away from Excel? Should they be moving away from Excel? Should they be looking at full automation? Or is there a more fundamental shift approach still required? Now, Rashab, I want to ask you kind of like your view, because I know you guys have been on a journey as far as this is concerned. What's your view? Do you need to go full automation? Is Excel a thing of the past? Is that the kind of evil villain people make it out to be? Or are there ways of dealing with this?
So as it is mentioned in the BCBS 239 as well, that the basic expectation, I mean, a firm should have a strong IT infrastructure which is scalable, which is one of the prerequisite condition for a firm to be able to comply to all the other expectations mentioned in the BCBS guidelines, which is true. The firm should have a strong IT infrastructure. But the problem is that there is not a point or a target up to which a firm can say that they can upgrade their IT system to, which will take care of all the problems. That target is moving. It's ever moving. So, for example, if a firm has a IT infrastructure of this level of sophistication, which is capable enough to handle all the products that the firm has and all the regulatory expectations around it. But as you know, the financial market is ever growing. There will be introduction of new products and new risk, and the regulators will set their expectations to this level. They will make they will require the data at a more granular level in a much more complicated way. And by the time the firms will upgrade their IT system to meet this criteria, the regulatory expectations will go there. So basically, this is an ever-going process. So I would just briefly would like to highlight on the point that the automation that we are trying to achieve at the moment. So these automation are a very basic form of artificial intelligence, where the machines are being trained in a supervised learning approach, which won't be sufficient to handle the complex products and the regulatory reporting around them in this financial space, because when you teach a machine using a supervised training, so what the machine does is only make the process fast and efficient. It doesn't take care of if a new product is introduced, if a new complex product or regulations have been introduced. The machine is as clueless as humans are. So you need to teach again, and therefore there is a lag between what the regulators are asking and the infrastructure that you have. And by the time you'll bridge those gaps, you already would be compromising a lot on your golden source of data.
Okay. I'm hoping the humans aren't completely clueless. Rieta, a quick one. Your thoughts, because I know you've worked quite a bit on automation projects. Is it required, or is there a bit of nuance involved?
I think it really depends on the organization, the ambitions of the organization, the maturity of the organization in terms of their reporting setup, their data landscape. So if you ask me, in an ideal world, do I think it would be great if everything is automated and we push buttons and the machines do all the grunt work and we spend time doing the investigations and the fun? Of course, I think automation is better, but it is not always possible to move away from some manual work. Theo, you know as well as I do that people in banks and every industry really loves Excel. Excel will always be around, and we'll always build some reports and some adjustments in Excel. But I think it is important to make sure that the big repeatable processes are as automated as possible. If there is something small that has to happen and something that takes quite a bit of manipulation on a regular basis, then of course there is still room for some flexibility. But the regulators don't like this, because every time you introduce a new manual process, every time you take your data out of a controlled environment, you do create the opportunity for introducing operational issues or manual mistakes that people make, finger issues. In some instances, some of these reports are pretty small. You can even build some controls around something like an Excel, and I know there are institutions who do like that, but that often, if it is for a bigger process, it often takes more effort to actually put a control around Excel than it does to just automate your process. So it's not a simple, clear-cut yes. I think in an ideal world, we would want everything to be automated, but we do know that the circumstances of every organization and the intricacies of every report is different. And in some cases, there is a little bit of room that you actually do need in order to just manually get done what you need to get done.
Yeah. Look, the outputs are known, and we know in advance what those outputs are, but the data environment does change. We just had the example of the GL accounting, etc. I just want to see if Colin's on the line, because I kind of had a next question for Colin. I think the timing is not great today. I think I'll park this question for when Colin is back around governance and ownership. It's one of his specific areas. But let me go to a question we've been getting a lot when speaking to clients. They ask us about the question is about the principles and the best practice. How should they address the reliability of reg returns? Is there a silver bullet? What is the best practice as far as this is concerned? And I kind of wanted to ask, maybe Rita, I'll ask you that, and I'll give Francis a chance to kind of respond as well, is how does one address best practice? What principles could one now lay down and say people should be considering going forward? Rita, are you comfortable?
It's a very tricky one. It's a very tricky one, Theo. I think everybody wants it.
I said that's why I'm giving it to you.
I think everybody wants a silver bullet, and everybody wants the problem to disappear very easily and to make sure that everything is set up the right way. I think in terms of best principles and best practice, it is so important to make sure that you understand your data. You understand the processes that create your data, and you build proper control points throughout the process, throughout the life cycle of your regulatory reports, to make sure that you don't lose things and you don't inadvertently change data that you're not supposed to change. I think integration for me is fundamental as well. Integration does not mean that you need one big data lake or one big data landscape where everything is fully connected to each other, but it does help, right? If you have an environment where all of your data is tagged with similar GL codes and you can slice and dice to see your risk view versus your finance view, a lot of the effort spent in explaining why certain things are different just disappears, right? Because you actually have the data to prove it. You don't have to go in and explain to your stakeholders why a different view of the data often results in a slightly different number. I think in terms of things like adjustments, it is important to make sure that you build for the organization and not for an individual process. If we have the greater good of the organization in mind, then the fact that I can do things in a small, flexible way in my own process, but it's not consistently applied, doesn't really make a difference anymore, right? We need to recognize that if we want to apply adjustments, if we want to change data, we need to do it consistently. Ownership is also a very big principle to start embedding, making sure that data is owned where it's created and making sure that there's responsibility for that data, that people actually know and understand the data they create. We often end in this debate, where does finance's ownership of a balance end and where does risk's ownership of an exposure begin? It's always a tricky one, and it always leads to very high emotions when we start discussing who actually owns a particular a particular data point. So I think it's not a simple solution. It is making sure you embed those principles and you embed them in a way that works for your organization and the maturity of your organization in a particular, in the life cycle of your regulatory reporting.
Right. Really, you touched on something interesting, governance. We'll get to that now, Rishabh. I think that's perhaps the next question for you specifically, and if Colin joins, I want us to talk about that. But Francis, your take about principles and best practice. I know this is your thing around digitization, building sustainable measurement of data. What are some of the things the guys must put down in place?
Yeah, I think we can start from the trees, and we have millions of trees around us.
Okay.
Can't mark up each one of them. So I try to come from the other side of the horizon. Technology is evolving exponentially, and it's not going to stop. Whatever reforms we now develop will take years to have an impact. So it needs to work. Say, if we take 20 years to build an LEI system, which is the moronic, simple no-brainer, that infrastructure needs to work in the world that will be ours in 20 years from now. So in 20 years, what system will we have? We will have a system that is globally even more integrated than today, that has much more automation, many more machines. So it is tightly coupled on a global scale. Whatever shock happens anywhere will spread in real time, instantly across the globe. So I come to a first conclusion with that. The things we do today cannot be upgraded simply the way they are. So for instance, reporting will not work ultimately, because the reporting supply chain that comprises all the work you do in the banks to produce the reports, sending the reports to the institutions, the central banks or others compiling all this, analyzing it, each one scraping the data at the bottom of their regulatory silo. That will never deliver on time, and it will never deliver on scale. If we want to understand such a phenomenon that will happen, a crisis, say, Lehman was an example, so it's not future science fiction, it's already a risk that's there, we need to measure global real time. So at least for the sensitive parts of the system. For that, we need to re-architecture the system. And what Rita said before is the right thing. Yeah, we need to have it all automated. But the ultimate conclusion I come to is that, well, we need to agree on one fact, one representation, digital. That representation used by everyone, that means the representation needs to have one truth, and it needs to be in the public infrastructure. Access can be regulated. But then at least all the operational systems will always draw on the accurate identity of a counterparty. Now, that work needs to be done once only, and so on. There are many benefits for everyone. Businesses will know better what their risks are. They will know their exposures better. They will have cheaper operations to run because there's no need for such reconciliation work and so on. Reporting, well, the bit that will still be reported will work better, more easily, less burden. And the automated access of regulators to the sharp parts of the system will become possible at last. So I think we will all be rewarded by that. We will have better control of the system, so less risk of being out of business because we have been hit by a crisis. But for that, again, we need a change of tack. And I see the responsibility for that, of course, with the public authorities. But the public authorities today seem to be largely unaware of the growth of the problem. And that's where I see the role of industry, to make them aware. Hey, guys, the way you regulate us is not what will work in 20 years from now. And given that you need 20 years to move, start thinking now, and let's think together.
Yeah, that's an interesting notion, Francis, that you're raising. We're kind of debating why, after many years of discussion and feeling the pain points, we can't get weekly, monthly, annual reporting reliable and accurate. You're speaking about real time, near real time. It's a fundamental change, but I do believe what we discussed here today is the basic building blocks, as we said, getting those things right. And I think 20 years, I think it's sooner than 20 years, to be honest. And we know the PRA has been talking about this real-time data collaboration and reporting. I'm not sure about the timelines around that, but certainly it gives you food for thought. Like what we're discussing here is not about an old problem. It's really putting that lens on, putting that hat on, looking forward. It gives a different perspective. Thank you for that. Colin,
And just
nice
one
to have you back.
sentence.
Sorry,
One more
Francis.
sentence,
Yes.
if I may. Yeah, a very brief one.
Yeah.
The place where it needs to happen is the interface between the markets, the economic system, and the regulatory world. Because here we have a globally integrated, tightly coupled market system that faces a fragmented regulatory landscape that matches, say, human geography. That will not change, but we need to build something at the interface.
Okay, agreed. Colin, welcome back. Apologies, we haven't really given you any chance to speak. Like the once or twice it came up, you dropped. But I'm going to go straight to you before you leave again. And just basically, Rita touched, as you mentioned, one of the important principles and best practices around effective governance and ownership of this, right? And I think you mentioned some concerns on this previously when we spoke. Can you maybe just give me your insights around where you see governance and ownership fitting into this and some of the challenges you've had to overcome?
Yeah, sure. And apologies that I've been dropping in and out. So we'll hopefully we're back for good now. So yeah, I mean, obviously I've missed some of the discussions, but the past I've been very much some very, very interesting thoughts around this whole thorny issue. And I think if I'm going to sort of sum up, I guess, where the actual overall issues around regulatory reporting probably come from is, it does actually start right from the beginning, to be perfectly frank. It starts from how the regulations are written quite often. And I think, there's probably only pockets of expertise around it. But most of the times when regulations are written, they're not really particularly thought about how we will then demonstrate compliance and how we will then be able to report back on that. So that should be certainly one part of the issue is how can we write those reports, but also not make it almost an afterthought at the end of how do we, and it's same with lots of other regulatory change programs, to be perfectly frank, is that, people will, work on identifying what are the issues they need to tackle, what are the actions, what are the different parts that are in scope and out of scope. And sometimes it's only quite again, right at the end, someone will suddenly realise that actually, we've done lots of good work, but how do we demonstrate and how do we actually report what work we've actually done on that particular regulation? So it certainly is a governance piece in terms of, can we, someone mentioned a global regulator earlier, that would be fantastic. But, how can we best ensure that every time a regulation is written or rewritten or the actual, I guess, who is looking for the reporting from the back of that regulation, what is it actually trying to get to? Is it just demonstrate compliance? Is it actually to help demonstrate some more transparency within the market? And how can we make that more consistent then? Because that will provide that kind of effective governance across multiple regulations, and lots of companies now are regulated by many different organisations as well. So it's how do we make that consistency on the reporting piece, which will allow effective governance. But that's I think we're a long way away from that, to be perfectly frank. And the fact that the regulations themselves are already difficult, I guess, in the way that they're written, to actually be able to report out the back on those does make it, I think, very difficult for the regulators as well. They've got a whole bunch of information, lots of different data that's coming into them, from lots of different organisations. How do they make sense of that, and how do they pull that together as well? So, it's not just on the maybe the financial markets to get themselves, more up to date in terms of technology and digitise those type of reporting. But obviously, on the flip side of that, is also the regulators will also need to be able to do that themselves, so that actually all of that data and information does begin to make some sense, and it's worth collecting it all. Because I think that's maybe sometimes challenge is once you've started bringing in all this data, how do we make head or sense, or sense of, well, what does it actually mean, and how can we utilise it to both monitor the market and monitor that particular financial market more efficiently, but also ensure that people are complying with the regulation as well. Right. And definitely off the back of that, without a doubt, getting the right data in the right place within any organisation, I think, is a challenge. Usually, I think most companies and maybe the bigger companies are possibly more handicapped by this, is the fact that typically what the regulators are asking for doesn't necessarily always come from the same systems within your organisation. It doesn't come from the same databases, and may well come from a number of different product groups. So again, that becomes a big challenge as to how you best pull that data into a central repository, so that you can then start to report in a much more efficient and timely fashion as well. And also, I guess, across a financial service market, and I don't think it really matters which one we talk about, just the true cost of actually trying to comply with a regulation as well, and trying to reduce that cost. Yeah. Because every company is having to stand up a project. Every company is probably having to make some technology changes, having to throw some project resources, that type of thing. So it does become a big challenge across across a whole market as to how they can comply with that particular regulatory requirement. So again, massively the ownership of data, and and understanding where you need to get that data from. Maybe over time and more strategically, if you can understand exactly what the theme and the basis of a regulation, you can then begin to build up. We understand now that this data will meet these requirements. But again, the fact that regulations are obviously written jurisdiction by jurisdiction basis doesn't lend itself very well to that either.
Right. Thank you, Colin.
A lot of different challenges around.
Thanks, guys. So I'm just going to thank you, Colin, for the insight. Glad to have you back fully online. We're kind of running short on time, so I've got two questions. One that I want to get to shortly is around Evergrande and the linkage to the system. I think, Francis, you want to take the one shortly. Rita, there's one for you that I want to maybe start off with. Just very briefly, this was a pre-question that came from Farah in the UK. She would like to hear more on the real-life examples, data integration projects. So in other words, lessons learned, challenges, how to bend data controls in the environment, etc. Rita, I know you've been very involved. Any last-minute kind of points or insights that you could share? Because often these things go wrong because projects fail, right? A lot of attempts happen. Guys try this, there's restarts, a lot of money is getting spent, but things go wrong. In your mind, what are some of the practical considerations that Farah and the others could consider based on your experience? And then Francis will come to you. And please, everybody, do post your questions. This is typically where things really get interesting. We've got a few questions already lined up. Those who need to drop off can do so, but we'll continue and just answer these questions. Like I said, there's already a few, but Rita, if you can take Farah's question on the practicalities of this.
Yes, thank you, Theo. And I'll try to keep it brief because I think Evergrande is so topical at the moment. We're all very interested to hear what Francis has to say. Farah, I think for me, one of the big challenges we face is these are often such big projects and they're so daunting to enter into, right? And we make these project plans which last for 5 years or maybe even longer, and we only start to realize business benefits, or we only start to really pick the fruits of all the hard work by about year 2, year 3, if you're lucky in some of these cases. And I think what happens on a big journey like that is you often lose the buy-in. You spend so much time and effort to get that stakeholder buy-in initially that if you wait 2 years before you start delivering real benefits, you're going to lose that buy-in. So one of the key things that I try and focus on when I do a project like this is I try and say, what are the quick wins? What can we do to make people's lives easier very quickly so that they get bought into this, and so that they want to help you on this journey going forward, so that they actually see the real benefit that it would hold for them personally as well. I think speaking about that, change management is also fundamentally important. You have to sell this thing internally. You can't endeavor to do a project like this by forcing people to have to do it. you have to get them to want to do it. It is a big undertaking. And that mind shift between doing something because your boss says you have to do it or doing something because you realize the value in doing it is actually quite big in a project like this. And it will make it will make a long journey a little bit easier, and not as stressed and that sort of thing. I think another mistake that a lot of people make is they think that they already have all the expertise, so we can kind of just do this on the side of the desk. We can stress our resources a little bit. Yes, they've got month-end work to do and they've got hectic workday schedules, but we can probably fit this in on the side of the desk, and that's not possible, right? In order to do something like this, you need to have a dedicated team who are focused on delivering this. It's not, I will pick up this when I have the time available, because there will never be enough time to be available to do this. And speaking about that, I think how you structure that team is also very important. People sometimes think that it is easy to just get an army of external people in to come and solve your problem. That, from my experience, is also probably not the best way to go. You need to have an augmented team. You need to have people inside the organization who champion this, who know the institutional knowledge, who know the challenges that you face, who know how you yourself need to solve these problems. And they have to become a part of that team. And it's also important from a handover perspective to have that augmented team, because when the consultants eventually leave, or the external people that you've got to sort out your data landscape, you need to have somebody there to maintain this going forward, right? And you want those people to be a part of the journey, to understand why certain things are being done, how they should be done, to be able to maintain and support that going forward. I think we also need to realize that it's not just technology that's the answer. And I think Francis made this point earlier as well. Putting in the fancy technologies does help us. It helps us. It enables us to do certain things. But just saying that I'm going to put a data lake down without understanding what I'm putting into the data lake, understanding how I'm putting it into the data lake, and making sure that my processes speak to each other is also a recipe for disaster, right? Just having the technology is not the answer. It is what you do with that technology and how you implement the technology to enable your processes that actually makes the difference. And then finally, I think we all get under pressure and we all run out of time, and we end up putting sticky tape on solutions. We end up sticky taping this little hole that I opened up here. It's quicker and easier for me to just fix quickly, even though it's not strategic, and even though in the longer run it's not going to be great, and we create legacy issues for ourselves, right? So it is trying to be disciplined to make sure that we do the right things strategically for the organization, not to apply quick fixes, not to create little silos of processes, but to actually build an enterprise-wide solution that will sustain changes and that's flexible enough to deal with new regulatory requirements. I think those are some of the challenges. Those are definitely not all of them, but those are some of the big challenges that I've faced on some of these projects that I've been involved in.
Thank you, Rita, for that. Then we've got a question from Scott. Please, anyone else can also pose questions. Just very briefly, this one. Francis, this is one specifically for you, and I think it ties in very nicely with the Lehman kind of example you used earlier. Scott Hoverman says, we are watching the Evergrande crisis unfold. To what extent do we think this shock could impact on European banks, considering the linkage of the financial system? Before I give you a chance to respond, our CEO, David Buckham, and two of our colleagues, Christian Stroley and Robin Wilkinson, has just written a book called The End of Money, which is available on Amazon. It's been launched about 2 weeks ago, and it speaks exactly to the kind of conditions and the behavior in the financial system that's led up to this exact moment. So you guys can certainly go check it out. So just a quick punt of that. It's called The End of Money. But Francis, your views on this one, if you don't mind.
Yeah, I think this morning I read that Evergrande paid some interest due, so no default yet.
Yeah, we were all waiting, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, this is a big, complex problem. I don't talk about the psychological level, where people perhaps might feel fear or whatever. I look at the technical level, this network of contracts. If something happens with Evergrande, if they don't serve certain contracts, well, that will hit institutions in the network of contracts that are connected to them directly. Some of these institutions then might fail, and the impact might be transmitted through the result, through the contractual footprint of those failing institutions to the next ones. If we had a map of this network of contracts, we could actually know where we need to look. Those maps are slowly being built. For instance, reporting on derivatives. But I fear that there the data is not yet up to the level we need to fly through that network or representation of the network. And if it doesn't help to have one network of contracts on derivatives, one network of contracts and a credit in the EU on loans, if those two don't talk to each other. So we need to connect those two and many more. And we need to do it globally. So we are back to having all data on, so basically all contracts in the world. Ultimately, if we want to be, say, in sync with technology, in a big global cloud, that trend is going anyway, with access, of course, limited to the parties of the contracts, but with the ability for the regulators to be able to interrogate the whole system, then we would know in advance, oh, Evergrande, not a problem, put a little firewall here and there, and so long. Yeah. But as long as we don't have that system, it's down to the people who read these innards and the bones. You can ask the old San shamans to tell you. Yeah. But we lack the data infrastructure to be able to give a technically competent answer to such a question. That's my feeling, personally.
Good.
But it can be built.
Thank you very much. It can be built, and the fact is, I think it should be built. And we've had many examples where we've seen the need for this. It would have been money well spent. We're slightly over time.
So we need to kick the people who don't talk about this today, but who should be talking about this, because it will need a lot of discussion before we build. So we haven't even started really discussing.
And I think that's the point you made earlier, Francis. It was one of the questions I wanted to still ask you, and I think we're kind of out of time, but very briefly was to say that there's a different role for the regulator to play as well, and the interaction with them and industry, where industry does speak up, and the regulator will have to take a leading role and kind of provide that vision, which the institutions must execute on. We are slightly over time. Sorry, you wanted to add? Sorry, Francis, you were saying? Okay. We are slightly over time. We have one more question. Perhaps we could just delve. So I imagine people are dropping off. The session is being recorded. I think we'll address the last question. But please feel free to kind of, later if you wish to kind of follow this. Just at the end of this, there's a survey. So the Monocle research team is conducting a survey into the reliability of reg reporting and other emerging topics faced by banks. With such a large and geographically diverse group as we have here today, so it's 111 countries, 39 countries, 111 organizations, we have an ideal opportunity to actually enrich our collective insights by contributing individually to the survey. So do let us know at the end of this if you wish to participate and receive the results of this exercise by providing your responses at the end of this. We'll collate the results, and those who participate will share the insights with. And I always think this is a great opportunity to kind of we don't have chances normally to kind of meet like this. Yes, surely there's conferences, but really as diverse as today, this is what this new medium has allowed us. So let's leverage it and actually mine some insights from this. I have a last question, or the one we'll conclude with. We still have quite a few people online. I hear from Claudia. It's a question from William. One area we have attempted but not resolved sufficiently is with regards to adjustments. What advice do you have? It seems to be a never-ending challenge in our business. So perhaps, Rishab, I can ask you maybe in terms of how you guys have dealt with adjustment. Also know, Rita, that's specifically an area you're very strong on. So I'd like to maybe give you the last word on that one if you're comfortable. And then we will conclude the conversation there. Rishab, from your side?
Yeah. So manual adjustment. So it's a never-ending process, and this is the reason why I say that the automation level that we are trying to reach, we are following the supervised learning approach. But at the to deal with this problem, we need a unsupervised machine learning approach. And I would like to explain kind of. I would like to give a visual of how it works by an interesting example. So everyone must have heard of a chess engine called Deep Blue, the one that beat the Grandmaster Garry Kasparov. So the approach that was followed to teach that engine was that all the chess games that have been recorded were fed into the system, and that machine would refer to the positions in its database to decide what is the best move. The problem with this system is, if there is a position, if the pieces are in a position where there is no database in the system, the Deep Blue doesn't know what to do. and can make a move which is not the best one. And now the new chess engines that are coming in the market. So for example, AlphaZero. So AlphaZero is using a unsupervised machine learning approach. So what happens in that is AlphaZero is just taught all the rules and the objective that you have to checkmate the opponent's king. And then AlphaZero is made to play against AlphaZero itself. So in the first game, it doesn't know what to do. It doesn't know the sequence of moves that is required to checkmate the opponent's king. But just in a matter of 6 hours, the AlphaZero played millions of games and basically taught itself what is the best game and what you have to do in a situation which is not there in the past. So basically, AlphaZero is able to think out of the box. So when we are talking about reducing manual alterations, we need to follow the machine learning approach where the tool itself knows what to do if there is a gap, how to enrich it. And so that this is the only solution, universal solution, which can reduce the manual alterations to a minimum.
All right. Thank you for that. That's quite a unique perspective. I can't say that I've seen this application being done in terms of the adjustment process. We're more familiar with more of the traditional approach. Sorry, you were saying?
Yeah, sorry. So I was saying that we are in the business side of a unit. We are using all kind of artificial intelligence, be it in the marketing, in sales, in credit underwriting, in algo trading, for that matter. So we are using all kinds of sophisticated intelligence in the business side, but we are not using the same kind of sophistication in the regulatory reporting side. So to deal with all that kind of financial market products, we need to have such investments in this regard as well.
So the point you're making is there's a lot of opportunity there.
Yeah.
Rita, your thoughts lastly on adjustments? I know that's one of your specific areas.
Yeah, so I think I agree with Rishabh. I think in many instances we're not doing enough with our AI on the reg side. It's all customer centric and that sort of thing, which is amazing and exciting. But we can also use a little bit more on the reg side. However, adjustments for me is a tricky one, right? Because I think in an ideal world, we all wish that there would be no adjustments in a regulatory reporting process. Everything has to work and we should not have a need to adjust something. If we're adjusting something, then we should be able to fix it at source. Which reminds me of one of the principles that I skipped earlier in terms of best practice is making sure you fix at source, right? You always have to go back and fix at source. Now, if you speak to guys who are busy with regulatory reports and who are stuck in their workday schedules, they'll always tell you that they must have the ability to make a manual adjustment because you don't physically have the time to go fix it at source and rerun your process. Simple example, I think I spoke about it briefly earlier. Let's take an industry code or an industry classification. So I've got a company that is the financial services arm of a big manufacturing company. Comes into the credit risk process and I make my adjustment. I adjust it to be a financial institution because it's the financial services arm. It comes into the liquidity risk process and the liquidity risk process adjusts it to become a corporate because it is a corporate, right? So everybody's making adjustments, but we're not applying those adjustments consistently. And I think if we're designing this process and we allow the flexibility that we need in order to get our month-end processes working to adhere to our workday schedules, we need to give the ability for teams to make adjustments. But the fundamental thing that we have to get right is that we need to make sure that those adjustments can be applied consistently. So we all have visibility of what the adjustment is, and we all apply the adjustment in the same way, or if we don't, we should have reasons not to. And ultimately, the most important thing is to then say, if I need to adjust for this every month, I'm costing myself time, I'm costing myself effort. Ultimately, these things that I'm adjusting for should go onto a list and there should be a governance process around it to say, all of these things must be fixed at source. Why do I want to make the same changes to my data every single month if I can just go back and actually fix the source? And it must be possible. And if people tell you it's not, then we need to understand what those reasons are, because an industry code, a simple example is an industry code, you should be able to fix that at source in a matter of minutes.
Agreed. Thank you, Rita. With that, we will conclude. Rita, was it your final thought? Apologies.
Yeah, perhaps a final word, hearing what Rita said, which I fully agree with. I think with technology unfolding, we will see the proportion of work spent on fixes and adjustments increase. Yeah. So everything to fix it at source needs to be done, but that can only be done collectively. very little can be done locally. I mean, some can be done locally. That is why it is so important to seek the dialogue, facing the regulators with their responsibility in view of unfolding technology. Otherwise, they will remain, I would say, asleep at the wheel, but they will continue on the old tracks for much too long.
Thank you, everybody, for participating. I think we'll conclude with that as our final thought. Certainly, Francis and everybody. Thank you, Francis, Rishab, Colin, Rita, yourself as well. The panel, I look forward to connecting with you all on LinkedIn and continuing the conversation. You can download our insights paper, which captures some of these thoughts and some of those practicalities Rita referred to earlier. A reminder to please participate and let us know if you would like to be involved in the survey and receive those results. But until next time, thank you all and goodbye.
Thank you so
Bye-bye.
much. Thank you so much. Yeah, on behalf of Marcus Evans Group, Monaco, thank you all. And Theo just said, we also have a survey there. Please go ahead and answer that survey, download resources, and we will be connecting very soon. So thank you. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Bye-bye.